quibbles over the way they handled Shinra's opera window sequence in the last cutscene aside, I really like the scenes that follow, because not only do we get a really effective reintroduction to Barrett here, but also like as you're if you it's also really effective, this sequence, if you've played the original game beforehand, because as Cloud is making his way through the rubble after walking away from the cutscene, instead of just the empty map that you would get in the original game, you have survivors who made it out. So even though you've gone through this whole sequence and there have been all these places where Avalanche could have saved the day but couldn't because of the fucking whispers, there's immediate feedback that there has been a positive impact by all of this, and that's I like it. I think they pull it off well. It's like you can get on the game's case for the Kingdom Hearts hooded figures and the Nomura infested reservations you might have about those, but when it comes to the smaller things, I think they do a good job of capitalizing on their concept here.
If you wanted to be cynical, you could say that because they have different people writing the moment-to-moment dialogue than plotting out the overall plot structure. But that would be a cynical take on things, which we never do here.
But I'm pretty sure they do have more than just Nomura plotting out the overall plot structure.
Oh yeah, I don't think nearly any game has just one person working on the plot on it anymore.
Well, as many have said before, he didn't write the story. I still think that he holds a lot of clout as a director, which doesn't really matter anymore because he's not directing the series anymore after this one.
Oh.
Yeah, he's dropping directorial duties after.
He's still kind of the guy who has to okay everything, but he's not the guy in the day-to-day.
Well, that's fine. Nomura's problem is that he kind of gets a little high on himself when given a little too much control. So I think...
Well, that and he can't just, progress. Everything has to be as technologically advanced as possible. So if he can squeeze 2 more pixels out of this warble effect, he will do so.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, if he's in a high enough position that his ideas can add value to a thing, I think that's a good place to have him. It's when he's in the place where nobody can frickin' slap his hand away from the keyboard when he gets a bit too much. That's when he becomes a bit of a problem. But he's got genuine talents. He's a great character designer when he doesn't go overboard with belts. And he's also, he's got creative ideas in his head. And
I still think he's a phenomenal monster designer as well.
Filter some of those ideas through other creative minds who can add their own input and, maybe give a second opinion when something is a bit much, then it all tends to work out really well for him. It's not as if he hasn't been in the lead for some really phenomenal games. It's just that he's also been in the lead for some projects that went completely sideways, like Versus 13, which never got off the ground.
Yeah. Because it should be, I don't think the man is bad at what he does in terms outside of designing stuff. It's just that if left unchecked, it gets really nonsensical and not in a fun sort of way.
The main problem with Versus 13 ended up just being general poor management, because he had this really ambitious idea he was trying to push, as I remember, where he was trying to find a new way to blend cutscene cinematics with interactive gameplay beyond just QuickTime events, which is an avenue worth exploring, but perhaps one he should have put off to a future project if he couldn't get the one he was working on out in time.
That also seems like something you would relegate to a smaller project first to iron out the kinks before putting it into something that probably cost tens of millions of dollars.
Well, it depends on what the idea was. From the sound of it, it was the kind of idea that you would need a budget to pull off if you were trying to pull it off at all, so it might not be something you could do in a smaller project. But, I guess we'll never know, because whatever his idea was, it never happened.
No, it's okay. They'll just make it a Kingdom Hearts game instead.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you haven't played Remind already, I think you already got the answer to that.
Well, I mean, he had his not Noctis person in there, and the obvious cinematic callbacks to the old Versus trailers, but I don't think that is anywhere close to the game that he was making, so much as him
No.
just venting his spleen about not being able to make that game.
Spleen. Huh?
So, question. Nomura wasn't really involved in Final Fantasy XIII that much, if I remember correctly, right?
No, you're just character designer.
Yeah, okay. So, honestly, Nomura hasn't really been involved in any... hasn't been greatly involved, I should say, in many of the games that came out that people didn't like. Like, I mean, I don't know a lot about what games in the Kingdom Hearts series people like and dislike. I just know that Kingdom Hearts itself can be a somewhat divisive series.
Yeah, because he hasn't had any time to really do much in Final Fantasy because of Kingdom Hearts. You know, Kingdom Hearts is his baby.
Kingdom Hearts he's been working on, like Kingdom Hearts 3. Yeah. I think that's just the big thing, is it isn't so much what's come out, it's more just how long it takes for something to come out and the general drama that happens because of it. Like, okay, Kingdom Hearts 3 being announced in, 2011? And not coming out for 9 years or whatever. Similar thing
Something
with
of the sort,
Final Fantasy VII Remake. I know he's not the most involved with this, but that also was announced 3 or 4 years too early.
Final Fantasy VII Remake was originally being outsourced, but they, I guess they took part of what that developer had created and moved it in-house, and that was a large part of the delay there.
I imagined it was something similar to the Rumored Adventure 1 and 2 remake things, where they outsourced it and they just did not like what they were seeing, so they kind of had to bring it back in.
Yeah.
That's kind of what happened with Metroid Prime as well. Metroid Prime 4, apparently they outsourced it, and they didn't like what happened, and so they had to bring it back to Retro. Wait, is Sephiroth just randomly showing up here now?
This is another hallucination.
Okay.
And it's in place of one of the early scenes in the original game where you heard Sephiroth's name briefly, and it was clear Cloud was thinking about him, but because he hadn't been introduced yet, they didn't do anything with it on the spot. But, well, obviously they've introduced Sephiroth before this scene, so there's reason to retool how they handle this scene.
Yeah, because this was originally just a white backdrop with text.
The words he spoke in the flashback about carrying the blood of the ancients, that was what was in the original scene. This hallucination where Sephiroth tells him that he has failed again is new and is in reference to the fact that this is not the first time this Sector 7 plate has fallen, and it is not the first time that Avalanche has failed to stop it.
It also references the whole Cloud wanting to be a soldier thing and being kind of shit at his job, and so the whole thing in Nibelheim.
Yeah, there's multiple purposes.
I know we've already kind of gone over this, but I still hate the way that they're doing Sephiroth in this game. Like, you could just replace him with any, your anger makes you powerful. Mwahaha. It's like...
Well, that's not really what he's doing, though, because, again, this is original timeline Sephiroth.
I know, but that's also... It doesn't matter what he's trying to do. It matters how he comes across, and he comes across way more generic and...
It does sort of come across that way, but I would argue that it's intended to come across that way as a smokescreen, so that when you rethink what he says later, pending late game plot twists, you realize he was talking about something else.
And I guess I'm not a big fan of that as well, because that just leans into more meta, stupid, time warpy kind of nonsense that is generally, to me, the weakest part of these games.
You see, this just comes down to you and me having a really different opinion of that concept, because this kind of stuff is the stuff that gets my imagination going.
I live for this sort of spicy variety.
Let me clarify a little bit. I don't mind what if scenarios. What if scenarios can be genuinely interesting. Like they do it in comic books all the time. What if Superman landed in Russia instead of in the United States? What if Gwen Stacy became Spider-Man instead of Peter Parker? That stuff's interesting. What I don't like is when the game's like, this is an alternate timeline, and then it's like, okay, and instead of just having stuff be different and exploring what it would be like if it's different, you're spending an entire game talking about, oh, this is why it has to be different, and we've got these things that are not that interesting, and it's a bunch of mystery box bullshit that's unnecessary. If you want a different story, just tell the story different.
It's not really being mystery box, because everything gets explained by the end of this game as far as what's going on here. The other thing you have to remember is that this game is intentionally fucking with the idea of what a remake is, based on the title alone.
I mean, that's sure, but it's at the, like, is that interesting? To
I
me,
think
like,
it
here's the
is.
thing. Well, let me explain. It's just like, okay, you've got these whispers that are supposed to keep the timeline on track. Okay, sure, but I don't feel like they're that compelling. Like, they're just kind of ghosty type stuff.
No, and I think it's more interesting to know a newbie's perspective if they jumped into 7 Remake for the first time as their first Final Fantasy VII experience, what they think about the whispers and all that. But as an original player, you're both enticed and frustrated at the presence of the whispers because you know for a fact these weren't an element in the original game. But as you keep playing, when you realize what they're trying to do, it grips you because, well, okay, what exactly is happening here? And in that element, I would say that's where the game has its mystery blocks, sure. But this isn't a case where they're setting up things that they're not going to pay off for later. Because by the end of this game, to jump ahead here, we're very much in uncharted territory.
Yeah, the whispers are done after.
Yeah, the whisper
Yes.
plot begins in this game and it is resolved in this game. So in that
Yes.
sense, I consider it a fairly successful story element.
It's just frustrating that they want to have their cake and eat it too. They want this super faithful nostalgia trip remake in order to make people be excited about it. And they also want to make things different in order to tell their own new what-if story based on the world of Final Fantasy VII. And you can't do both at the same time. That's just not how.
Well,
those
here's the
things
thing, though,
work.
Ted.
It's not doing the first part, though.
I'll have to disagree with you there. It's not their intention to faithfully recreate the original game. They've always had this planned from the start.
Well, no, that maybe I misspoke there. Not faithfully recreated as in make it the same game, but they want to hit the same beats because that's what a remake does. They want to have the scenes that everybody remembers and be like, oh, I remember Cloud dressing up like a girl. I remember when the thing fell, the plate fell. I remember all of this stuff.
The thing is, the only segment of this game that is a one-to-one recreation of the original game is the bombing mission. That's it. After that point, things start to get screwy.
I get what you're saying, Ted, but I also disagree that it is a problem in any sense or stretch of the imagination. So I guess there's
I don't.
not
Well,
really much
it's
to
a
talk
problem
about
to
here.
me because
If the
it
game was
feels
more of an
hacky.
example of what Ted was getting at, then I would agree. But that's not exactly what Remake is trying to do.
It's not doing a one-to-one remake until like the final few hours, then suddenly the rug gets pulled from under you.
It feels hackneyed to me that all of this stuff has to be explained and you can't just write a new story. And because there's the thing, the plot elements they add in order to explain it, I just feel are not interesting or well done. Like there's these ghosts, they're changing stuff, sure, but does the fact that they're changing stuff matter to anyone who hasn't played the game before? No. Like
No, but you see,
because
they're not changing anything. They're trying to keep things in check.
That's what I mean though, is the fact that
so here's the kind of thing you have to realize. Again, the point is to remake Final Fantasy VII, not in the sense that they want to build the game up and have it be the same thing you did. They are remaking what Final Fantasy VII is supposed to quote unquote be.
Yeah, it's just why can't they just do that? Why do they
because
have to justify
then it's not a remake. So the idea is you call it remake not to say it is a one-to-one recreation, but to say we are remaking the game. That's kind of the play on words they're using here.
So the thing about it is that when you say it like that, it just reminds me of the people who are like, oh, 368 over 2 days makes sense because that's how long the game takes, and it's 2 characters, and it still sounds dumb. It's still dumb.
Not really, because remake has different meanings. You know,
And nonsense title, Kingdom Hearts bullshit aside, we're talking about a fairly basic pun. So, you know,
I don't think that.
Okay,
like,
okay. I'm just gonna say this. The reason this title works and the Kingdom Hearts title doesn't, is because this title understands how English works.
I don't care about what the game's titled. Here's my problem is just simply that this game did not decide what it wants to do until the very end. In which case, it's
it did. No, it didn't.
Well, that's what you're saying. It's like there's minor changes throughout, but so far the game has gone through the same events that the original Midgar section has gone
because it's
through.
showing us that the Whispers are trying to keep it on track despite the fact that differences are starting to happen.
That's what I mean. The game is trying to say, oh, look how different we are, but we're going through the same plot motions with only the slightest of differences until the very end.
No, hold on. I'm going to stop you there, Ted. Well, I get what you're getting at, and it is true. Like if we're to break events in chunks as to how point A goes from point B to point C and point D, yes, in that way it is similar. But at a point, it goes so out of control that the ending to this is so radically different.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, how much longer in the game until the stuff really starts changing?
Here's the thing.
It's already started changing.
Yeah, it has.
I would say in not major ways. Everything still goes pretty much as prescripted. Like, the most major change that has happened so far is a bunch of people got out of the plate. What else major has changed?
I also feel that you're not giving enough credit to the nuance between the events.
Every time you step into another chunk of the game, the butterfly effect has been building up, and the Whispers have been appearing in more overt ways because of this. Every new chapter that you get into the game adds more to the build-up because of the changes, and then by the time you get to Shinra Tower, things have gotten out of hand to the point where things aren't playing out the same way anymore. And the Whispers are getting involved, but now Sephiroth is effectively dicking around with the Whispers.
Okay, so let me just ask
Still
the
a little
question
Fortnite dances on top of the building.
Why couldn't the game just have this stuff happen without the Whispers being there in the first place? What do they add to the story?
Because it's an explanation in universe as to why things are different.
Why do you need
it's
that
an explanation in
Why can't it
universe
just
as
be
to why
different?
things did not go completely different from the word go. The idea is that the characters are struggling against fate at first without knowing it, and then by the end of the game under a full understanding of the fact that there is a fate, and that they may not necessarily like the direction that fate goes for themselves. Like,
I don't. Well, I sure like.
Ted, you have to remember, this is a remake of one of the most famous games ever made.
Yeah. So
it is if you just make something different, you're going to piss people off who want an actual remake. And then if you do too much of the same thing, you get people to ask why can't I just play the original?
I don't feel bad because that's what happens when you decide to remake one of the most famous games of all time. You are putting yourself under that scrutiny no matter what.
And to that credit, just to wrap this real quick, because I remember saying this in my podcast last year, that while I am excited / nervous about where the series is going after this, I do simultaneously also feel cheated that it is not a 1-to-1 remake of the original game. It's just 7 original with just HD assets. You know what I mean?
So let me just, because this is the point I've been trying to get to here, is that you guys do say that stuff does diverge differently by the end.
Yeah.
Which, okay, yes, that is true. But my thing is that if that's what's interesting to you about this remake, you're given that possibility of, oh, what if we can change things? And then the game stops and says, give me $60 more 5 years from now and we'll continue.
That's not what it's doing, though, because this is the part of the game where the changes are super apparent and plot important.
Yeah, but that's...
Because we'll see going on that Wedge isn't dead. We see him around and he does stuff.
Yeah, but that's what... I think the big changes that people want to see, though, don't start until after you leave Midgar. That's what people want to see, and before you can see how this stuff makes the game vastly different, the game stops and you're expected to wait. And again,
I think you're skimming over all the little details that have been slowly building up to those big changes.
It's just, I think that those,
which granted only means much to veterans, I feel, because again, I think newbies are not going to catch them.
I can't tell that much is different other than these characters did not die in their right spots, and there's these ghosts here now, and Sephiroth is being an asshole. I've played the game before. I know what happens. It's the same beats so far. And the new beats just, I feel, are hackneyed and bad.
There is that, but like, well, not the bad part. I do not think that's the case. But even when we're hitting the same beats, we're also expanding on them. So the game is kind of pulling double duty. That said, I wanna ask you something about what you're saying. A lot of what you're saying comes down to why don't they just do this? I would ask, why should they?
Because it doesn't add anything. If anything, it takes it away and makes it feel more artificial. Like, you can have agents of, let me explain. So, okay, having an agent of fate, making it so that things are supposed to go the way they should be, only matters to anybody who has played the original game. Thus, making it not feel like its own story, making it feel like it's a spin-off.
All the other stories that have agents of fate and time travel in them don't matter because they didn't have an original game beforehand.
Well, that's because they're in universe. You know, if there's a story where there's an agent of, let me explain.
I was gonna say this.
If there's a story in a game where there's some agent of fate who's trying to make sure that destiny happens the way it should be, and it's all contained in one story, then okay, sure. But if you're making this remake of a game, having an agent of fate here is bringing up the fact constantly that you are not playing an original story. You are not playing a new case of Final Fantasy VII.
Why is that a problem?
Because it takes me out of it. It takes me out of the story to be like, oh, it's not, new things can't happen. It's supposed to happen this way. Ooh, spooky ghost come in. It's just dumb. It's like,
I would say that's one interpretation you can take from it, sure, but I would also think that as from a newbie's perspective, it makes you interested in what exactly is happening in this world that you decided to jump into.
It's not even just that. It's like, maybe a newbie wouldn't have as much problem with it because everything is new, but as somebody who has played the original game, it takes me out of the experience entirely, that they're just coming up with, okay, we're going to do things slightly differently, but we have to explain why we're doing something
what this
differently
comes down to is some
it.
people might be into it and other people aren't.
No, what I'm talking about is that they have to justify this shit that doesn't...
You can't reduce this fraction, Lewis.
It's frustrating that they have to explain something that doesn't need to be explained. You can just change stuff. It's your own story.
They're not explaining it because it needs to be explained. They're explaining it because that's the concept they wanted to explore.
And okay, then I think they did it bad. I think they did a bad job if that's the concept they want to explore.
Job.
Okay, you can.
We're not even at the end of the game yet.
Sephiroth being Emperor Palpatine is also dumb. All right, next part.